The lightning split the Wyoming sky like God himself was tearing the heavens apart, and Beatrice Calloway had never felt more lost in her entire 22 years of existence. The rain hammered down so hard she could barely see 3 feet in front of her horse, and when the animal finally gave up and refused to take another step, she couldn't blame the poor beast. She slid off its back, her legs nearly buckling beneath her, and stumbled forward through the mud and darkness until she saw it. A faint glow of lamplight in the distance that promised shelter, warmth, and perhaps salvation from this God-forsaken storm that had blown her miles off course. She had been traveling from Denver to meet her uncle in South Pass City, Wyoming, a journey that should have taken her through relatively safe territory with the small wagon train she'd paid to join. But the storm had separated her from the group 3 hours ago, and in her panic and inexperience, she'd ridden in completely the wrong direction. Now here she stood, soaked to the bone, shivering so violently her teeth chattered, pounding on the heavy wooden door of what appeared to be a ranch house. The door swung open, and Beatrice found herself staring up at the tallest man she'd ever seen. He had to be at least 6'3", with broad shoulders that filled the doorway and dark hair that fell just past his collar. His eyes were a striking green, like summer grass after rain, and they widened with concern as he took in her bedraggled appearance. "Good God, woman, get inside," he said, his voice a deep rumble that somehow cut through the sound of the storm. He reached out and practically pulled her through the doorway, then stuck his head out to look around. "Are you alone, my horse?" Beatrice managed through chattering teeth. "Just outside, couldn't go any further. I'll get him in a minute. Right now you need to get out of those wet clothes before you catch your death." He shut the door firmly against the wind and rain, then turned to face her properly. "I'm Harrison Emerson. This is my ranch." "Beatrice Calloway," she said, wrapping her arms around herself in a futile attempt to stop shivering. Water pooled on his clean wooden floor beneath her feet, and she felt a flush of embarrassment even through her misery. "I'm so sorry to intrude. I was traveling to South Pass City and got separated from my wagon train in the storm." Harrison was already moving, grabbing a thick blanket from a chest near the fireplace. He draped it around her shoulders with surprising gentleness for such a large man. "South Pass City is a good 15 miles northeast of here. You rode pretty far off course." He guided her toward the fireplace, where a healthy fire crackled and popped. "Sit here. I'll get your horse settled and find you some dry clothes." "I can't ask you to go back out in that storm," Beatrice protested weakly, but Harrison was already pulling on a heavy oilskin coat. "That animal saved your life tonight. Least I can do is give him a warm stall and some feed." He grabbed a lantern from a hook by the door. "There's coffee on the stove. Help yourself. I'll be back shortly." Then he was gone, and Beatrice was alone in the warm, surprisingly tidy ranch house. She looked around as she huddled near the fire, taking in her surroundings. The main room was spacious, with sturdy furniture that looked handmade but well-crafted. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with more volumes than she would have expected to find in a remote ranch house. A large table dominated the center of the room, and beyond it, she could see a kitchen area with a cast-iron stove where a coffee pot indeed sat, sending up fragrant steam. Her curiosity about Harrison Emerson would have to wait, though. Her entire body was shaking with cold, and she knew he was right about the wet clothes. She glanced at the door, then at the windows. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and she could barely see anything through the rain-streaked glass. She was quite alone. Moving quickly, she peeled off her soaked traveling dress, her underthings, and her ruined boots, wrapping herself tightly in the blanket Harrison had given her. She hung her wet things over a chair near the fire, hoping they might dry by morning. Her long auburn hair hung in wet ropes down her back, and she wrung it out as best she could before settling into the chair closest to the hearth. True to his word, Harrison returned within 15 minutes, though he looked even more soaked than before. He hung his dripping coat by the door and ran a hand through his wet hair, sending droplets flying. "Your horse is settled. Good sturdy animal. He'll be fine by morning." "Thank you," Beatrice said, clutching the blanket more tightly around herself. "I truly cannot express how grateful I am. I thought I was going to die out there." Harrison's expression softened. "Wyoming storms can be deadly, especially this time of year. It's early May now, but the weather hasn't quite made up its mind about spring yet." He disappeared through a doorway and returned a moment later with an armful of clothing. "These were my mother's. She passed 2 years back, but I kept some of her things. You look about her size. They'll do until your clothes dry." Beatrice took the garments gratefully, noting how carefully he avoided looking directly at her blanket-wrapped form. "I'll just—" She gestured vaguely toward the room he'd emerged from. "That's the bedroom. Take your time. I'll make us some supper." In the privacy of the bedroom, Beatrice examined the clothes Harrison had given her. A simple cotton dress in a soft blue, clean undergarments, and thick wool socks. Everything was neatly folded and smelled of cedar, as if it had been carefully stored away. She dressed quickly, touched by the intimacy of wearing his mother's clothes and by his obvious care in preserving them. When she emerged, she found Harrison at the stove, stirring something that smelled absolutely divine. He changed into dry clothes himself, dark trousers and a clean work shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms. His feet were bare, which somehow made the whole situation feel more intimate and real. "I hope you like stew," he said, glancing over his shoulder at her. "It's nothing fancy, but it's hot and filling." "It smells wonderful," Beatrice said honestly, settling into one of the chairs at the table. "I haven't eaten since this morning." Harrison ladled generous portions into 2 bowls and brought them to the table, along with thick slices of bread and butter. He sat down across from her, and for a moment they ate in companionable silence, the sound of the storm a constant backdrop to their meal. "So," Harrison said eventually, "you were heading to South Pass City. Family there?" Beatrice nodded, swallowing her mouthful of stew. "My uncle owns a mercantile there. He offered me a position helping him run it after my parents died last winter." "I'm sorry for your loss," Harrison said, and the genuine sympathy in his voice made Beatrice's eyes prick with unexpected tears. "Thank you. It was fever. Took them both within a week of each other." She cleared her throat, pushing down the grief that still felt so raw. "I had nothing keeping me in Denver, so when Uncle Thomas wrote with his offer, it seemed like a sign, a chance to start fresh somewhere new. And instead you ended up lost in a storm, taking shelter with a strange man," Harrison said with a wry smile. "Not quite the fresh start you were hoping for, I imagine." Beatrice found herself smiling back. "Well, the night isn't over yet. Perhaps things will improve." They talked as they ate, the conversation flowing more easily than Beatrice would have expected given the unusual circumstances. Harrison told her about his ranch, how he raised cattle and horses, and had been working this land for 5 years now, building it up from almost nothing. His parents had been among the early settlers in the area, arriving in 1867 when Harrison was just 15. They'd claimed the land and built the original cabin, though Harrison had expanded it significantly after his father's death 3 years ago. "So you've been running this place alone for 2 years?" Beatrice asked, impressed despite herself. She'd grown up in the city and knew almost nothing about ranching, but even she could tell that managing a spread this size single-handedly would be an enormous undertaking. "Mostly alone," Harrison confirmed. "I have a hand who comes up from town a few times a week to help with the heavy work, and during roundup I hire on extra men. But day to day, yes, it's just me." He paused, studying her across the table. "It can get lonely if I'm honest. The silence gets heavy sometimes." There was something in his voice when he said that last part, a vulnerability that made Beatrice's heart squeeze unexpectedly. "I can imagine," she said softly. "Though I confess I've never known that kind of solitude. I grew up in a boarding house my parents ran. There were always people coming and going, voices and footsteps at all hours. Sometimes I used to dream about silence." "Be careful what you wish for," Harrison said, but his tone was gentle, not bitter. "Though I suppose there's a difference between chosen solitude and loneliness forced upon you." "Yes," Beatrice agreed. "I think there is." They cleaned up the dishes together after supper, falling into an easy rhythm that surprised Beatrice. She washed while Harrison dried, and they continued talking, sharing stories of their vastly different upbringings. Harrison had grown up learning to ride and rope and shoot, helping his father build their dream of a successful ranch. Beatrice had grown up learning to cook and clean and manage accounts, helping her mother run a respectable establishment that catered to merchants and traveling salesmen. "Seems like we've both spent our lives learning to work hard," Harrison observed as he hung the dish towel to dry, "just in different ways." "I suppose that's true," Beatrice said. She glanced toward the windows where rain still lashed against the glass. "I hope the storm breaks by morning. My uncle will be worried when the wagon train arrives without me." "Wagon train won't arrive tomorrow even if the storm does break," Harrison said matter-of-factly. "This kind of rain will have turned every creek into a river and every low spot into a bog. They'll have to wait it out, same as us. Could be several days before the roads are passable." Beatrice's stomach dropped. "Several days. But I can't impose on you for several days." Harrison turned to face her fully, his green eyes serious. "Miss Calloway, you aren't imposing. You're welcome to stay here as long as necessary. As long as forever, if it came to that, though I doubt the weather will be quite that uncooperative." The words hung in the air between them, more significant than they should have been. As long as forever. Beatrice felt her cheeks warm and looked away, suddenly very aware of how intimate their situation was. She was wearing his dead mother's clothes, standing in his kitchen in her bare feet, with night falling and the storm raging outside. They were completely alone, miles from the nearest neighbor, and yet she felt oddly safe. More than safe, if she was honest with herself. She felt drawn to this quiet, serious man with his gentle hands and his lonely green eyes. "Thank you," she said finally. "I appreciate your kindness more than I can say." "It's not kindness," Harrison said quietly. "It's just being human. Anyone would do the same." But Beatrice wasn't so sure about that. She'd heard too many stories of women traveling alone, of the dangers they faced, of the men who saw isolation as an opportunity rather than a responsibility. Harrison Emerson could have been one of those men, but instead he'd given her his mother's clothes and his food and his shelter, asking nothing in return. "Still," she said, "thank you." They settled in for the evening, Harrison insisting that Beatrice take the bedroom while he made up a bed for himself on the sofa near the fire. She protested, but he was adamant. "You've been through an ordeal tonight," he said firmly. "You need proper rest. Besides, I've slept on that sofa more times than I can count. It's comfortable enough." Beatrice finally relented, too exhausted to argue further. She bid Harrison good night and retreated to the bedroom, closing the door behind her. The bed was large and comfortable, with clean sheets and a thick quilt, and she sank into it with a sigh of relief. Her body ached from the long day of riding and the stress of being lost in the storm, but her mind was racing. What strange twist of fate had brought her to Harrison Emerson's door tonight? What would have happened if she'd ridden in a different direction, if she'd missed seeing the light from his windows? She could have died out there in the storm, frozen and alone, her body not found until spring turned to summer. Instead, she was warm and safe and dry, lying in a comfortable bed in the home of a man who seemed almost too good to be true. Harrison was handsome, certainly, with his strong features and his striking eyes, but it was more than that. There was a steadiness to him, a quiet competence that made her feel secure. And there was kindness in him, a gentleness that showed in the way he moved and spoke. Beatrice rolled onto her side, staring at the wall and listening to the storm outside. She was being foolish, she told herself. She'd known this man for all of a few hours. She was simply overwhelmed by the circumstances, grateful for his help, reading too much into ordinary human decency. By tomorrow morning, in the clear light of day, she would see him as just a man. Nothing special, and these strange, fluttering feelings in her chest would disappear. But even as she thought it, she wasn't sure she believed it. In the main room, Harrison lay awake on the sofa, staring at the ceiling and listening to the storm. He couldn't remember the last time he'd had another person in his house, especially not a woman. The presence of Beatrice Calloway had transformed his space somehow, made it feel less like a bachelor's lonely refuge and more like a real home. She was beautiful, he couldn't deny that. Even bedraggled and half-frozen, she'd taken his breath away when he opened the door. Her auburn hair, her large brown eyes, the delicate structure of her face. But it was more than her looks that had struck him. It was the intelligence in her eyes, the way she'd insisted on helping with the dishes despite being exhausted, the easy way conversation had flowed between them. Harrison told himself he was being ridiculous. She was a stranger who would be gone as soon as the storm broke and the roads cleared. She had a life waiting for her in South Pass City, a family member expecting her, a future already planned out. The last thing she needed was a lonely rancher reading too much into a few hours of storm-forced proximity. Still, as he finally drifted off to sleep, his last thought was of her smile across the dinner table, and the way his house had felt warmer with her in it. Morning came gray and wet, the storm having settled into a steady, soaking rain rather than the violent downpour of the night before. Beatrice woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, and for a moment she was disoriented, unsure where she was. Then memory flooded back. The storm, the ranch, Harrison. She dressed quickly in the same borrowed clothes, ran her fingers through her hair in a futile attempt to tame it, and opened the bedroom door to find Harrison at the stove once again. "Good morning," he said, turning to smile at her. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in weeks," Beatrice admitted, moving to pour herself a cup of coffee. "That's a very comfortable bed." "It was my parents'," Harrison said. "My father made the frame himself when they first settled here. Good solid work." They ate breakfast together, and Beatrice was struck again by how comfortable it all felt. She'd expected awkwardness after spending the night in a bachelor's home, expected Harrison to be distant or inappropriate or somehow different in the morning light. But he was the same as he'd been the night before, kind, respectful, easy to talk to. After breakfast, Harrison announced that he needed to see to the animals and check on any storm damage. "You're welcome to come with me if you'd like," he offered. "Might be nice to get some air, even if it is wet. Or you can stay here where it's warm and dry." Beatrice thought of sitting alone in the house all morning and quickly made her decision. "I'll come with you if you have a coat I can borrow. I'm curious to see your ranch." Harrison's face lit up with pleasure, and something warm bloomed in Beatrice's chest at the sight. He found her an oilskin coat and a pair of boots that were too large but wearable with extra socks, and they ventured out into the drizzly morning together. The ranch was more extensive than Beatrice had realized. Besides the main house, there was a large barn, several corrals, a chicken coop, and various other outbuildings. Harrison walked her through his operation, explaining how he managed everything with a mix of pride and matter-of-fact practicality. "Right now I've got about 50 head of cattle and a dozen horses," he said as they stood in the barn, looking out at the rain-soaked pastures beyond. "Not huge numbers, but it's a good foundation. In another few years, I'm hoping to double the herd." "It seems like an enormous amount of work for one person," Beatrice observed. "It is," Harrison admitted. "Some days I wonder if I'm crazy for trying to do it all myself. But this land, this ranch, it's mine. Built with my own hands and my own sweat. There's something satisfying in that, even when it's exhausting." They checked on Beatrice's horse, which seemed none the worse for wear after its ordeal, then spent time feeding the other animals and making sure everything was secure. Harrison moved with efficient purpose, clearly at home in this world of mud and manure and physical labor. Beatrice found herself watching him more than she probably should, admiring the way his body moved, the competence in his every action. When they returned to the house around midday, both somewhat damp despite the coats, Harrison suggested they work on drying Beatrice's traveling clothes properly so they'd be ready when she needed to leave. "Though I have to tell you," he added as they hung her dress near the fire, "the main road into South Pass City crosses Tyler Creek, and that creek is going to be running high and fast for at least a few days after this rain stops. It won't be safe to cross until the water goes down. So I really might be here for several days," Beatrice said, the reality of it settling over her. "I'm afraid so," Harrison said. He glanced at her, something uncertain in his expression. "I hope that's not too terrible a prospect." "Not terrible at all," Beatrice heard herself say. "Actually, it's rather nice. Peaceful." "Peaceful," Harrison repeated, and he smiled. "I like that. Yes, it is peaceful here most of the time. I'm glad you see it that way." They spent the afternoon in companionable domesticity. Harrison had ranch accounts to work on, and Beatrice found herself looking at his books with a practiced eye, noticing discrepancies and inefficiencies that came from his lack of formal bookkeeping training. She mentioned a few things casually, and before long Harrison had asked for her help organizing his records properly. "My mother used to handle all this," he admitted, looking somewhat embarrassed. "I've been muddling through since she passed, but I know it's a mess. I'm much better with cattle than with columns of numbers. I practically grew up doing bookkeeping," Beatrice assured him. "Let me help. It's the least I can do after your hospitality." They worked together for hours, Beatrice showing Harrison a better system for tracking his expenses and income, helping him see patterns in his accounts that he'd missed. She was impressed by how successful his operation actually was, once she could see the numbers clearly. "Harrison, you're doing much better than you seem to think," she told him as they reviewed the corrected accounts. "With a few small changes to how you manage things, you could be quite prosperous." Harrison looked at the neat columns she'd created, his expression a mix of surprise and pleasure. "You did all this in a few hours. It would have taken me weeks to sort through that mess." "Different skills," Beatrice said, echoing his words from the night before. "You can build a barn and birth a calf. I can balance books and manage inventory. Neither is more valuable than the other." "They're just different." "Maybe," Harrison said, but he was looking at her with something like wonder. "But right now, your skills are feeling pretty valuable to me." They made dinner together that evening, working side by side in the kitchen. Beatrice found herself laughing as Harrison told her stories about his early days trying to run the ranch alone, the mistakes he'd made, the lessons he'd learned the hard way. "I once spent 3 hours chasing a cow through the brush because I'd forgotten to close a gate properly," he admitted, grinning at the memory. "By the time I got her back, I was covered in scratches and mud, and I swear that cow was laughing at me." "I'm sure you were quite a sight," Beatrice said, smiling at the image. "I looked like I'd been in a fight with a mountain lion and lost," Harrison confirmed. "My mother took one look at me and couldn't stop laughing. Then she made me strip down to my union suit on the porch before she'd let me in the house." The image of Harrison in his underwear made Beatrice blush, and she quickly turned her attention back to the vegetables she was chopping. But Harrison had noticed her reaction, and when she glanced up, he was watching her with an intensity that made her heart race. "Beatrice," he said softly, and the way he said her name made her shiver. "I know this is an unusual situation, you being here, the two of us alone like this. If I'm making you uncomfortable in any way, you need to tell me." "You're not," Beatrice said quickly. "Not at all. I feel safe here with you." "Good," Harrison said, but he didn't look away, and the air between them felt suddenly charged with something electric. "That's good. Because I have to confess, having you here, it's the best I've felt in longer than I can remember. This house has been so quiet, so empty, and now it feels alive again." Beatrice set down her knife, her hands trembling slightly. "I feel it too," she admitted. "I know I shouldn't. We've only known each other a day, but being here with you, it feels right somehow. Like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Harrison took a step toward her, then stopped himself, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. "I don't want to take advantage of the situation. You're stranded here, dependent on my hospitality. The last thing I want is for you to feel pressured or obligated in any way." "I don't feel pressured," Beatrice said, taking her own step forward, closing the distance between them. "I feel drawn to you, Harrison Emerson. That's not obligation. That's something else entirely." Harrison reached out and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "You're not what I expected when I opened my door last night," he said quietly. "Not at all. What did you expect?" Beatrice asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone who needed temporary shelter and would be gone by morning, leaving my life exactly as it was before," Harrison said. "Instead, I got you, and now I can't imagine you leaving, can't imagine going back to the silence and the emptiness." "Then maybe I won't," Beatrice said, surprising herself with her boldness. "Maybe I'll stay, as long as forever if you'll have me." Harrison made a sound that was half laugh, half groan, and pulled her into his arms. The embrace was warm and solid and felt like coming home, and Beatrice wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing her face against his chest and breathing in the scent of him. Soap and wood smoke and something uniquely his own. They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other in the kitchen while dinner simmered on the stove, and the rain continued its steady drumming on the roof. When Harrison finally pulled back enough to look down at her, his eyes were bright with emotion. "I don't know what tomorrow brings," he said. "Don't know if this is temporary madness brought on by the storm or something real that will last. But I do know that right now, in this moment, I've never been more certain of anything than I am of wanting you here with me." "Then that's enough," Beatrice said. "We'll figure out the rest as we go." They finished making dinner in a state of quiet joy, stealing glances at each other, finding excuses to touch as they moved around the kitchen. The awareness between them had shifted, become acknowledged, and it changed everything and nothing all at once. Over the next 3 days, as the rain continued and the creek stayed too high to cross safely, Harrison and Beatrice fell into a rhythm that felt natural and right. They worked together on the ranch in the mornings, Beatrice learning quickly despite her complete lack of experience. Harrison was a patient teacher, showing her how to feed the chickens, how to check the horses' hooves, how to spot signs of illness or distress in the cattle. "You're a natural," he told her on the third day as she successfully helped him move a stubborn cow from one pasture to another. "Sure you weren't a ranch girl in secret?" "Quite sure," Beatrice laughed, slightly breathless from the effort. "But I'm finding I like this life more than I expected. There's something satisfying about physical work, about seeing the direct results of your efforts." In the afternoons, they worked on the ranch accounts and other administrative tasks. Beatrice helped Harrison write letters to buyers, organize his inventory of supplies, and plan out his breeding schedule for the horses. She could see his respect for her growing as she demonstrated her own competence, and it felt good to be valued for her skills. But it was the evenings that Beatrice treasured most. After dinner, they would sit together near the fire, talking for hours about everything and nothing. Harrison told her about his dreams for the ranch, his hopes of building something that would last for generations. Beatrice shared her love of reading, her secret dream of one day having a library of her own filled with books from floor to ceiling. "There's space for that here," Harrison said softly. "That whole wall, we could build shelves from floor to ceiling. Fill them with whatever books you want." The implication hung in the air, that she would be here long enough to need a library, that this was more than a temporary arrangement. Beatrice's heart swelled with hope and fear in equal measure. On the fourth night, as they sat together on the sofa watching the fire, Harrison took her hand in his. "Beatrice, I need to say something, and I need you to be honest with me about how you feel." Beatrice's heart began to pound. "All right." "These past few days have been the happiest I've known in years," Harrison said, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. "Having you here, working beside you, talking with you, it's made me realize how lonely I've been. How much I've been just existing rather than truly living. You've brought light and warmth and laughter back into this house, back into my life. And the thought of you leaving, of going on to South Pass City and your uncle's mercantile, it's like thinking about the sun going out." Beatrice felt tears prick her eyes. "Harrison." "Wait, let me finish," he said gently. "I know this is fast. I know we've only known each other a few days. I know you had a whole life planned out, and I'm asking you to throw all of that away on the basis of less than a week together. But Beatrice, I'm falling in love with you. Maybe I've already fallen, and I need to know if there's any chance, any possibility that you might feel the same way." Beatrice didn't hesitate. She reached up and cupped his face in her hands, meeting his green eyes directly. "Harrison, I do feel the same way. I've been falling for you since that first night when you gave me your mother's clothes and your food and asked nothing in return. These past few days, working beside you, learning your ways, sharing our dreams and fears, it's only made those feelings stronger. I don't know if it's wise or sensible or rational, but I'm falling in love with you too." The joy that blazed across Harrison's face was beautiful to see. He leaned down slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that was gentle and sweet and full of promise. Beatrice melted into it, her hands sliding back into his hair, her body pressing closer to his. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Harrison rested his forehead against hers. "Stay," he whispered. "Not just until the creek goes down. Stay permanently. Marry me, Beatrice. Build a life here with me." "Yes," Beatrice breathed, and then she laughed at the simplicity of it, at how easy the decision was when it should have been impossibly difficult. "Yes, Harrison, I'll marry you. I'll stay." They kissed again, longer this time, deeper, with more urgency. Harrison's hands came up to frame her face, and Beatrice had never felt more cherished, more desired, more wholly seen and understood. "We should do it properly," Harrison said when they finally broke apart again, both flushed and smiling. "I should ride into town tomorrow and speak to the pastor. Get a marriage license. Do this right." "Tomorrow?" Beatrice asked, her eyebrows rising. "You want to marry me that quickly?" "I want to marry you right now, this instant," Harrison admitted. "But I know that's not practical. Still, why wait? We're both of age, both certain of what we want. Why waste time with a long engagement when we could be building our life together right away?" Beatrice thought of her uncle in South Pass City, expecting her arrival. She would need to send him a letter explaining what had happened, though she had a feeling Thomas Calloway would understand. He'd been the one to tell her to grab happiness wherever she found it after all, after she'd expressed her fears about starting over alone. "All right," she said. "Tomorrow you ride into town, speak to the pastor and get the license, and we'll be married as soon as possible." Harrison let out a whoop of joy that made Beatrice laugh, and he pulled her into his arms again, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "You won't regret this," he promised against her hair. "I swear to you, Beatrice, I will spend every day of the rest of my life making sure you're happy, making sure you never regret choosing me and this ranch." "I know I won't regret it," Beatrice said confidently. "I've never been more sure of anything." That night, they stayed up late making plans, talking about their future with the excitement of children planning an adventure. Harrison would expand the house, add another bedroom and a proper study for Beatrice's bookkeeping work. They'd buy more livestock, hire on permanent help so the work wouldn't all fall on Harrison's shoulders. They'd start a family, fill the house with children and laughter and life. "How many children do you want?" Harrison asked, his arm around her shoulders as they sat close together on the sofa. Beatrice considered. "I've always thought 4 would be nice, enough to keep each other company but not so many that they'd get lost in the crowd." "What about you?" "4 sounds perfect," Harrison agreed. 2 boys to help run the ranch, 2 girls to help their mother manage the house and accounts. "Or 2 girls who want to run the ranch and 2 boys who prefer bookkeeping," Beatrice countered with a smile. "We'll let them be whoever they want to be." Harrison laughed and kissed the top of her head. "Fair enough. Though I hope at least one of them likes ranching, or I'll have spent all this effort building something with no one to pass it on to." "I think you'll be a wonderful father," Beatrice said softly. "Patient and kind and strong. Our children will be lucky to have you." "And they'll be brilliant and capable because they'll have you," Harrison replied. "Teaching them to read and figure and think for themselves. We'll make a good team, you and I." The next morning dawned clear and bright, the first truly sunny day since Beatrice's arrival. True to his word, Harrison saddled his horse right after breakfast and prepared to ride into town. South Pass City was about a 3-hour ride, which meant he wouldn't be back until late afternoon at the earliest. "Are you sure you'll be all right here alone?" he asked for the 3rd time as he checked his saddlebags. "Harrison, I'll be fine," Beatrice assured him, touched by his concern. "I've helped you with the animals enough that I can manage the basic chores, and I'll work on organizing your supply room while you're gone. It's a disaster in there." Harrison laughed. "It is, isn't it? All right, but if anything goes wrong, anything at all, you stay in the house and wait for me to get back. Don't try to handle it yourself." "I promise," Beatrice said. She stood on her toes to kiss him, still marveling at the fact that she could do so freely now that this man was going to be her husband. "Ride safely." Harrison mounted up, giving her one last long look. "I love you, Beatrice Calloway, soon to be Beatrice Emerson." "I love you too," Beatrice replied, her heart full to bursting. Now go before the day gets away from us." She watched him ride off, then turned back to the house with a smile. Her house, soon. Her home. She could barely believe how much her life had changed in just a few days. She'd come here lost and frightened, running from grief and seeking a new start. She'd found all that and so much more. The morning passed quickly as Beatrice tackled the supply room. Harrison hadn't been exaggerating about its condition. Sacks of feed were stacked haphazardly, tools were scattered across every surface, and there seemed to be no organizing principle whatsoever to how things were stored. She rolled up her sleeves and dove in, sorting and stacking and making mental notes of supplies that were running low. She was so absorbed in her work that she almost didn't hear the sound of horses approaching around midday. When she finally registered the noise, she felt a flutter of concern. Harrison wouldn't be back for hours yet, and he'd said their nearest neighbor was several miles away. She wiped her dusty hands on her borrowed apron and went to the window to look out. 3 men were dismounting in front of the house, and Beatrice's stomach clenched with unease. They looked rough and worn, with the kind of hard faces that spoke of difficult lives. One of them had a visible gun on his hip. She quickly moved away from the window, her mind racing. Harrison had told her to stay in the house if anything went wrong. That seemed like good advice right now. A heavy knock sounded on the door, making her jump. "Hello in there. Anyone home?" Beatrice moved to the door but didn't open it. "Yes, I'm here. What do you want?" "Just some water for us and our horses, madam," the voice called back. "We've been riding since dawn and our canteens are empty. Won't take but a minute of your time." It was a reasonable request, and refusing it would be seen as a serious breach of Western hospitality. But something about the situation made Beatrice deeply uncomfortable. She was alone and vulnerable, and these men were strangers. "My husband isn't here right now," she called through the door, hoping the lie would make them think twice about any ill intentions. "But I can bring water out to you. Please wait there." She hurried to the kitchen and filled a large pitcher with water from the pump, grabbing several tin cups as well. Her hands shook slightly as she did so, but she forced herself to stay calm. They probably were just travelers needing water, nothing more sinister than that. Taking a deep breath, Beatrice opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, keeping the pitcher held firmly in both hands. The 3 men were standing a respectful distance away, and they pulled off their hats when they saw her. "Much obliged, madam," the one who'd knocked said. He was the oldest of the 3, probably in his late 40s, with graying hair and tired eyes. "Name's Jack Miller. These are my boys, Tom and Pete. We're heading up to the mining camps looking for work." Beatrice relaxed slightly. That made sense. There were several active mining operations in the mountains west of here, and men were always traveling through looking for jobs. She poured water for each of them, and they drank gratefully. "Your husband around?" the one called Tom asked, and Beatrice didn't like the way his eyes lingered on her. "He'll be back shortly," she said firmly. "He just rode out to check the far pasture." Another lie, but a useful one. Better they think Harrison might appear at any moment. "That's good," Jack said, shooting his son a quelling look. "A woman shouldn't be alone out here. Too much can go wrong." "You got yourself a good man, looks like. This is a fine ranch." "Thank you," Beatrice said. "If you'll excuse me, I need to get back to my work." "Of course, madam. Thanks for the water." Jack handed back his cup and gestured for his sons to do the same. "We'll just water our horses at the trough and be on our way." Beatrice nodded and retreated back into the house, locking the door behind her. She watched from the window as the 3 men watered their horses, her heart still beating faster than normal. Tom kept looking back at the house, and something about his expression made her skin crawl. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 minutes, the men mounted up and rode off. Beatrice let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding and leaned against the wall, suddenly shaky. Nothing had actually happened, she told herself. They were just travelers, and they'd been perfectly polite. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been wrong about the whole encounter. The afternoon dragged on, and Beatrice found herself jumping at every sound, constantly checking the windows for any sign of the men's return. She tried to go back to organizing the supply room, but her concentration was shot. Finally, she gave up and sat in the main room with one of Harrison's books, though she barely registered the words on the page. When she finally heard the sound of a horse approaching as the sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon, she rushed to the window, weak with relief at the sight of Harrison riding toward the house. She threw open the door and ran out to meet him, and he barely had time to dismount before she was in his arms. "Beatrice, what's wrong?" Harrison asked, alarmed by her reaction. He held her tightly, one hand stroking her hair. "Did something happen?" "I'm probably being foolish," Beatrice said, pulling back to look up at him. "Some men came by asking for water. They were polite enough, but one of them, the way he looked at me, it made me uncomfortable. I've been jumping at shadows ever since." Harrison's face darkened. "3 men. One older, 2 younger." "Yes, how did you know?" "I passed them on the road about an hour back. They're wanted for robbery over in Rock Springs. The sheriff told me to be on the lookout and warned me they might be passing through this area." He cupped her face in his hands, his expression serious. "Beatrice, I'm so sorry. I should never have left you alone if they'd tried anything." "But they didn't," Beatrice said firmly. "I told them you were just out checking the pasture and would be back any minute. I think that's why they didn't try anything." "Quick thinking," Harrison said, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "Still, from now on, when I need to go into town, you're coming with me. I won't leave you here alone and vulnerable again." "I'd like that," Beatrice admitted. "I know I'm probably perfectly safe here, but after today, I'd feel better staying close to you." Harrison held her for a long moment, then finally released her and reached into his saddlebag. "Well, I've got something that might cheer you up. Look." He pulled out an official-looking document, and Beatrice saw it was a marriage license, properly filled out and signed by the county clerk. "Pastor Williams agreed to perform the ceremony this Sunday," Harrison said, his face breaking into a smile. "That's 3 days from now. I know it's quick, but he said he saw no reason to delay when 2 people are certain of their commitment." "Sunday," Beatrice repeated, joy flooding through her. 3 days until I'm your wife." 3 days, Harrison confirmed. He pulled her close again, kissing her forehead. "I also sent a telegram to your uncle explaining the situation. I hope that was all right. I figured he'd be worried when you didn't arrive with the wagon train." "That was thoughtful," Beatrice said. "What did you tell him?" "The truth. That you were separated from the group in a storm, took shelter at my ranch, and we fell in love. That you've agreed to marry me and will be staying here permanently. I told him we'd visit as soon as we could make the journey." "And what did he say?" Harrison's smile widened. "He wired back within an hour. Said, and I quote, about time that girl had some luck. You take good care of her or answer to me, Uncle Thomas." Beatrice laughed, tears springing to her eyes. "That sounds like him. He'll be happy for me, for us." They went inside together, and Harrison told her about his trip to town while she prepared dinner. He'd bought fabric for a new dress for her to wear at the wedding, stopping at the general store and consulting with the owner's wife about what would be appropriate. He'd also purchased supplies to expand the house, planning to start work on the additions right away. "I want you to have a proper study," he said. "A place that's all yours, where you can work on the accounts and read and just have space to yourself when you need it. This house is going to be your home, and I want you to feel like every inch of it belongs to you." "Harrison," Beatrice said softly, moving to stand in front of him. I already feel at home here, not because of the house, but because of you. You've made me feel more welcome, more valued, more loved in 5 days than I've felt anywhere in years. The house is just a building. You're what makes it home." Harrison pulled her into a kiss that was deeper and more passionate than any they'd shared before. Beatrice responded in kind, her arms winding around his neck, her body pressing against his. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "3 more days," Harrison said, his voice rough with desire and restraint. "3 more days and you'll be my wife in truth, not just in my heart." "I can wait 3 days," Beatrice said, though her body was telling her otherwise. "But just barely." The next 3 days passed in a flurry of activity and anticipation. Harrison worked from dawn to dusk each day, starting the expansion on the house and making sure everything was in perfect order for Beatrice's permanent residence. Beatrice worked alongside him when she could, but she also spent time altering the fabric he'd bought into a simple but elegant dress for the wedding. In the evenings, they continued their long conversations, learning more about each other with each passing hour. Harrison told her about his childhood, about the challenges his parents had faced as early settlers, about the sacrifices they'd made to build their ranch. Beatrice shared her own memories, both happy and sad, painting a picture of a childhood spent in the controlled chaos of a busy boarding house. "Were you happy?" Harrison asked one night as they sat together watching the stars through the open window. "Before your parents died, I mean. Was it a good life?" Beatrice considered the question carefully. "Yes and no. I loved my parents and they loved me. But I always felt like I was living someone else's life, playing a role that was expected of me rather than being my true self. When they died, as terrible as the grief was, there was also this small, guilty sense of freedom. Like now I had permission to figure out who I really was and what I really wanted." "And have you figured it out?" Harrison asked quietly. "I'm starting to," Beatrice replied, turning to look at him. "I want a partnership, not just a marriage. I want to work beside someone building something meaningful. I want children to raise and teach. I want to use my mind as well as my hands. I want a life that matters, even if it's just to one person. Even if that person is you." "It won't just be me," Harrison said. "It'll be our children. Our grandchildren. Everyone whose life we touch in whatever small way. You matter, Beatrice. You've mattered since the moment you knocked on my door." Sunday morning dawned clear and beautiful, with a warm breeze that carried the scent of sage and wildflowers. Harrison and Beatrice dressed in their finest clothes, Beatrice in the dress she'd made and Harrison in a suit he'd had since his father's funeral. They looked at each other in the morning light, both nervous and excited. "Ready?" Harrison asked, offering his arm. "Ready," Beatrice confirmed, taking it. They rode together into South Pass City, which was bustling with activity despite it being Sunday. The town had sprung up during the gold rush era, and still had a rough frontier feel to it, with false-fronted buildings lining the main street and miners and ranchers mixing with merchants and their families. The church was a simple white building at the far end of town, and Pastor Williams was waiting for them on the steps. "Mr. Emerson, Miss Calloway," he greeted them warmly. "Are you ready to be married?" "We are," Harrison said firmly, his hand tightening on Beatrice's. The ceremony was simple but moving. They stood together in the small church with its rough wooden pews and plain cross, and exchanged vows that promised forever. Harrison's voice was steady as he promised to love and honor Beatrice for all his days, and Beatrice's eyes filled with happy tears as she made the same promises to him. When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife and told Harrison he could kiss his bride, the kiss they shared was sweet and pure and full of joy. Beatrice felt like her heart might burst with happiness as Harrison pulled her close, his arms strong around her, his lips gentle against hers. They signed the marriage certificate with the pastor's wife and the church secretary as witnesses, and then they were officially Mr. and Mrs. Harrison Emerson. As they walked out of the church into the bright Wyoming sunshine hand in hand, Beatrice felt like she was walking into a completely new life. "Mrs. Emerson," Harrison said, testing out the name. "I like the sound of that." "So do I," Beatrice agreed, squeezing his hand. "So do I." They stopped at the general store to pick up a few supplies, and so Harrison could introduce his new wife to the townspeople. News of their quick courtship and marriage spread through the small town like wildfire, and Beatrice found herself the subject of much curious attention. But Harrison stayed close by her side, his pride in her obvious, and gradually she began to relax and enjoy the social interaction. "Your husband's a good man," the storekeeper's wife, Mrs. Peterson, told Beatrice quietly while Harrison was arranging for delivery of some lumber. "Lost his parents and could have turned bitter, but he just worked harder instead. He deserves happiness. I'm glad he found you." "I'm glad too," Beatrice said sincerely. "He's given me a new life when I desperately needed one." They also stopped briefly at the mercantile to meet Uncle Thomas. He was a tall, spare man in his 50s with kind eyes and a quick smile, and he embraced Beatrice warmly when they arrived. "So this is the rancher who stole my new employee," he said, shaking Harrison's hand with mock severity. "I suppose I can forgive him, seeing as how happy you look, Beatrice." "I am happy, Uncle Thomas," Beatrice assured him. "Happier than I ever imagined being." "Then that's all that matters," Thomas said. "Though you'll have to come visit regularly. I want to know my new niece by marriage and hear all about your adventures on that ranch of his." They promised to visit often, and then Harrison and Beatrice headed back to the ranch as the afternoon sun began its descent. They rode close together, Harrison's arm occasionally brushing against Beatrice's, both of them quiet but content. When they reached the ranch, Harrison dismounted and reached up to help Beatrice down. But instead of setting her on her feet, he swept her up into his arms, making her gasp in surprise. "What are you doing?" she laughed. "Carrying my bride over the threshold," Harrison said, grinning at her. "It's tradition." He carried her up the porch steps and through the door, only setting her down once they were inside. But he didn't let her go, keeping his arms wrapped around her waist, looking down at her with an expression so full of love that it took Beatrice's breath away. "My wife," he said softly. "I still can't quite believe it's real." "It's real," Beatrice assured him, reaching up to touch his face. "I'm really here, really yours, really staying forever." "Forever," Harrison repeated. "I'm going to hold you to that promise, Beatrice Emerson." "I'm counting on it," she said, and pulled him down into a kiss. Their wedding night was tender and sweet, a discovery of each other that was both nervous and exciting. Harrison was gentle with Beatrice, patient and caring, making sure she felt safe and cherished. And Beatrice gave herself to him completely, trusting him with her body as she'd already trusted him with her heart. Afterward, they lay together in the big bed, Beatrice's head on Harrison's chest, his arms wrapped securely around her. The night sounds of the ranch drifted through the open window, the soft lowing of cattle, the chirp of crickets, the whisper of wind through grass, and Beatrice had never felt more at peace. "Thank you," Harrison murmured into her hair. "For what?" Beatrice asked, tracing idle patterns on his chest. "For knocking on my door that night, for staying, for taking a chance on a lonely rancher and his quiet life, for making me happier than I ever thought I could be." "Thank you for opening that door," Beatrice replied, "for offering shelter and kindness to a stranger, for seeing something in me worth keeping, for giving me a home and a purpose, and a love I never thought I'd find." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, and Beatrice's last thought before dreams claimed her was that she'd finally found where she belonged. The months that followed were busy and fulfilling beyond anything Beatrice had imagined. She threw herself into ranch life with enthusiasm, learning everything Harrison could teach her. She learned to ride properly, to identify different grasses and judge their quality, to spot signs of predators around the property. She took over all the bookkeeping and correspondence, freeing Harrison to focus on the physical work he loved. Together, they hired 2 permanent ranch hands, young men from town who were hardworking and reliable. With the extra help, Harrison was able to expand the operation more quickly than he'd hoped, and by the end of summer, they'd increased their cattle herd by 20 head and added several more horses to their breeding stock. The house expansion was completed by early fall, giving Beatrice the study Harrison had promised and adding an extra bedroom for the family they hoped to have. Beatrice filled her new study with the books they'd accumulated, creating the library she'd always dreamed of, and spent happy hours there working on the ranch accounts or simply reading for pleasure. She also made friends among the neighboring ranch wives, women who welcomed her warmly into their community. They taught her to can vegetables from the garden Harrison had helped her plant, to make butter and cheese, to sew and mend and make soap. In return, Beatrice helped some of them with their own bookkeeping and taught reading lessons to their children. Through it all, her love for Harrison only deepened. She loved watching him work, the easy competence with which he handled the challenges of ranch life. She loved his patience when she made mistakes, his pride when she succeeded at something new. She loved the way he looked at her each morning as if he still couldn't quite believe she was real, and the way he held her each night as if she was the most precious thing in the world. By Christmas, Beatrice was fairly certain she was pregnant, though she waited until she was sure before telling Harrison. On Christmas morning, after they'd exchanged simple gifts by the fire, she took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "There's a baby growing here," she said softly. "Our baby. Due sometime in late summer, I think." The expression on Harrison's face was one of pure, overwhelming joy. He pulled her into a fierce embrace, then dropped to his knees and pressed his face against her stomach, his shoulders shaking with emotion. "A baby," he whispered. "We're going to have a baby." "We are," Beatrice confirmed, running her fingers through his hair. "Are you happy?" Harrison looked up at her and there were tears on his cheeks. "Happy doesn't even begin to cover it. Beatrice, you've given me everything, a home that's warm and alive again. A purpose beyond just survival. And now a child, our child. I don't have words for what I'm feeling right now." "Then don't try to find words," Beatrice said gently. "Just feel it. We'll figure out the words later." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Harrison was attentive to the point of being comical. He refused to let Beatrice do any heavy work, insisted she rest frequently, and worried constantly about her health and the babies. Beatrice found his concern both touching and occasionally exasperating. "Harrison, I'm pregnant, not made of glass," she told him one day in early spring when he'd forbidden her from helping birth a calf. "Women have been doing physical work while pregnant since the dawn of time. Other women can do what they want," Harrison said stubbornly. "My wife is going to take it easy and not take any unnecessary risks." But despite his overprotectiveness, or perhaps because of it, Beatrice felt cherished and safe. She knew that no matter what happened, Harrison would move heaven and earth to keep her and their baby safe. Their son was born on a hot August evening in 1875, with the help of a midwife from town and Harrison pacing anxiously in the main room. The birth was difficult but not dangerous, and when Beatrice finally heard her baby's first cry, She wept with relief and joy. "It's a boy," the midwife announced, carrying the cleaned and swaddled infant to Harrison. "A big, healthy boy. Congratulations." Harrison took his son with shaking hands, staring down at the tiny face with absolute wonder. When he was finally allowed into the bedroom to see Beatrice, he was still carrying the baby, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "He's perfect," Harrison said, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed. "Beatrice, you're amazing. Look what you've done. Look at our son." Beatrice took the baby into her arms, exhausted but exhilarated. Their son had a shock of dark hair and when he opened them, green eyes just like his father's. "What should we name him?" she asked. "I was thinking Henry," Harrison said, "after my father, Henry James Emerson." "If that's all right with you." "Henry," Beatrice repeated, smiling down at her son. "I love it. Henry James Emerson. Welcome to the world, little one." Life with a baby was exhausting and wonderful and terrifying all at once. Beatrice had never been around infants much, and she learned as she went, grateful for the advice of the other ranch wives. Harrison was a devoted father from the start, taking night feedings when he could, walking the floor with Henry when the baby was fussy, changing diapers without complaint. "I never knew I could love anyone as much as I love him," Harrison confessed one night as they both stood over Henry's cradle, watching their son sleep. "Except I already loved you that much. How is it possible to have a heart big enough to hold this much love?" "I don't know," Beatrice said, leaning into his side, "but I'm grateful for it every day." As Henry grew from an infant into a toddler, he brought even more joy and chaos into their lives. He was curious and adventurous, constantly getting into things he shouldn't, and he clearly worshipped his father. By the time he was 2, he was trying to follow Harrison everywhere, his little legs pumping as he chased after his father around the ranch. "He's going to be a rancher through and through," Harrison said proudly, watching Henry attempt to help feed the chickens by throwing grain everywhere. "Look at him. Natural-born cattleman." "He's 2, Beatrice laughed. "He might change his mind a dozen times before he's grown." "Maybe," Harrison acknowledged, "but I don't think so. He loves this land the way I do. I can see it in him already." When Henry was 3, Beatrice became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect. Their second child, a daughter they named Hannah Rose, was born in the spring of 1879. She had Beatrice's auburn hair and a disposition so sunny that even her crying seemed somehow cheerful. "Now we have one of each," Harrison said, holding Hannah while Henry climbed into Beatrice's lap on the sofa. "A perfect little family." "Perfect," Beatrice agreed, though privately she hoped for more children. She loved being a mother, loved watching Harrison with their children, loved the noise and laughter that filled the house now. The ranch continued to prosper as the years passed. With Harrison's hard work and Beatrice's shrewd management, they built one of the most successful operations in the area. They expanded their land holdings, increased their herds, and even started breeding horses specifically for the cavalry, which proved quite profitable. More importantly, they built a life rich with love and purpose. Henry grew into a serious, responsible boy who did indeed love ranching as much as his father. Hannah was the social one, making friends with every person and animal she encountered. When their third child, another boy they named Robert, was born in 1882, the family felt complete. Beatrice sometimes thought back to that night she'd arrived at Harrison's door, soaking wet and lost, and marveled at how much her life had changed. She'd thought she was heading toward a quiet life of keeping books for her uncle. Instead, she'd found passion and partnership, had built something meaningful alongside a man who valued her for everything she was. "You ever regret it?" Harrison asked her one night as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The children were asleep inside, and the evening was peaceful and warm. "Giving up the life you'd planned for this one?" "Never," Beatrice said without hesitation. "Not even for a moment. This life, this family, it's everything I never knew I wanted, everything I needed without realizing it." "I think about that storm sometimes," Harrison said. "How easily you might have ridden in a different direction. How easily I might have missed you entirely. And I can't imagine my life without you in it now, can't even remember what it was like before." "It was quiet," Beatrice teased gently. "Peaceful, probably very boring." Harrison laughed and pulled her closer. "Incredibly boring, lonely as hell. I wouldn't go back to it for anything." As the years continued to pass, the Emerson family became a fixture in the South Pass City community. Harrison served on the town council, and Beatrice started a lending library that eventually became the town's first official library. Their children grew up healthy and happy, surrounded by love and the wide open spaces of Wyoming. Henry did indeed become a rancher, taking over more and more of the day-to-day operations as Harrison got older. Hannah surprised everyone by announcing at 16 that she wanted to study law, and with her parents' full support, she eventually became one of the first female lawyers in Wyoming. Robert split the difference, studying agriculture at university and returning to help modernize the ranch's operations. Through it all, Harrison and Beatrice's love remained the foundation on which everything else was built. They faced challenges, droughts and harsh winters, sick animals and difficult markets, the normal struggles of raising children and running a business. But they faced them together, always, drawing strength from each other. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Harrison surprised Beatrice by taking her back to that same church in South Pass City, where they'd been married. Pastor Williams had long since retired, but the building was unchanged, still simple and white and peaceful. "I wanted to stand here again," Harrison said, holding both her hands in his, "and renew the vows I made to you all those years ago. Because every promise I made then, I've kept. And I want to make them again, promise you again that I will love you and honor you for all my days." Beatrice felt tears spill down her cheeks as Harrison repeated the vows from their wedding day, his voice as steady and sure as it had been when they were young. When he finished, she did the same, promising again to love and honor him, to stand by his side through whatever life brought them. "As long as forever," Harrison said softly when she finished. "That's what I told you that first night, that you could stay as long as forever, and I meant it. I will love you for forever and beyond, Beatrice Emerson." "Forever and beyond," Beatrice echoed. "I wouldn't want anything less." They kissed there in the empty church, middle-aged and weathered by life, but still completely in love, still partners in every sense of the word. And when they walked out into the Wyoming sunshine, hand in hand as they'd done 25 years before, Beatrice felt the same joy and certainty she'd felt on her wedding day. As they grew older, Harrison and Beatrice gradually handed over more of the ranch operations to their children, but they never fully retired. Harrison still rode out most mornings to check the cattle, though now usually with Henry or Robert alongside him. Beatrice still kept the books, though Hannah often helped her, bringing a lawyer's precision to the financial records. They became grandparents, delighting in Henry's 3 children and Hannah's 2 and Robert's 4. The house they'd built together was always full of family, especially during holidays and special occasions. And through it all, Harrison and Beatrice remained each other's favorite person, still sitting together on the porch most evenings, still holding hands, still finding new things to talk about and old memories to revisit. On a warm evening in the spring of 1920, 45 years after their first meeting, Harrison and Beatrice sat on that same porch, watching their youngest grandchild chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. They were both in their late 60s now, their hair gray and their bodies slower than they used to be, but their hands were still clasped together and their love was as strong as ever. "You remember that storm?" Beatrice asked softly. "The one that brought me here?" "Every detail," Harrison said. "The way you looked when I opened the door, soaking wet and shivering, the relief in your eyes when I offered you shelter, the way my heart felt when I realized I wanted you to stay forever." "I was so frightened that night," Beatrice admitted, "so lost and alone. And then there you were, offering me everything I needed without even knowing me. You saved my life that night, Harrison." "No," Harrison said, squeezing her hand. "You saved mine. I was just existing before you came, going through the motions but not really living. You brought life and light and love into my world. You made everything worthwhile." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. Inside the house, they could hear the sound of their family children laughing, adults talking, the clatter of dishes being washed. It was the sound of a full, happy life, the kind of life neither of them had imagined possible all those years ago. "I'm glad I got lost in that storm," Beatrice said eventually. "I'm glad I found your door. I'm glad you opened it and told me I could stay as long as forever." "So am I," Harrison said. "So am I, my love, so am I." And there on the porch of the ranch they'd built together, surrounded by the family they'd created and the life they'd chosen, Harrison and Beatrice Emerson held hands and watched the night fall, grateful beyond measure for the storm that had brought them together and the love that had kept them that way. Their story had begun with a lost woman and a lonely rancher, and a door opened in kindness. It had become something beautiful and lasting, something that would echo through generations long after they were gone. As the years continued, Harrison and Beatrice remained devoted to each other until the very end. They lived long, full lives, surrounded by love and family, their partnership a testament to the power of taking chances and opening doors, of offering shelter to strangers and building homes from unlikely beginnings. Their children and grandchildren would tell their story for generations, the tale of how their family began with a storm and a knock on a door, and two people brave enough to believe in love at first sight. And when people asked how they'd known, how they'd been so certain after just a few days that they were meant to be together forever, Beatrice always gave the same answer. "Sometimes you just know. Sometimes your heart recognizes home when you find it, even if you've never been there before." Harrison's door was my home from the moment he opened it, and every day since has only proven that truth. Harrison, for his part, would simply smile and add, "Best storm that ever blew through Wyoming. Took everything from me, my solitude, my quiet, my carefully ordered life. And gave me everything that mattered in return: love, family, a reason to wake up grateful every single morning. I'd weather 1,000 storms for that." Their love story became legend in South Pass City and beyond. The tale of the rancher who told a lost woman she could stay as long as forever, and the woman who took him up on the offer. It was a story of second chances and new beginnings, of finding love in unexpected places, of building something beautiful from a foundation of kindness and trust. And it was a story with the happiest of endings, a love that lasted a lifetime and created a legacy that would endure long after the last stars had faded from the Wyoming sky.